No one wanted that scar. It hung, pale and puckered, along the hollow at the side of Mareñá Valdés' neck, like a secret that would not be kept. In the fierce market sun, it caught and flashed, not in a way to make her beautiful, but in a way that made some people look away, as if the sight of it might stain them by sympathy or shame. Children were told to pull their mothers' skirts tighter. Men shifted their purchases to the other side of the stall. A woman who might have been a buyer a moment before hardened her face and moved on. Mareñá stood behind a stack of crates and tried to make herself smaller. She was doing what she'd been doing these last years, tending the vendor's stall in exchange for bread and a corner to sleep in when the town closed its shutters. The stall smelled of citrus and dried fish. It smelled of other people's errands and the kind of day that promised rain but kept only dust. Her hands were steady, her back bent. Her eyes were often on the road, because where she kept watch, there were always reasons to watch. The magistrate who passed by with a fine hand on his satchel, the boys who loved to toss an insult as if it were coin, the siren-like merchants who offered work that vanished by dawn. The scar had a story, though who it truly belonged to had long since become a rumor. Some said she'd run from a burning home and gotten the mark when a burning beam had struck her. Others muttered that she'd tried to steal from a workshop and been branded. Children told their own versions, ridiculous and cruel. None of the versions did justice to what it had been. A collision of heat, fear, and a man's mistaken fury. For Mareñá, the memory lived mostly in fragments, smoke in the mouth, a child's voice she could not place, the raw ache of being singled out. That morning the market swelled into a tide. A cart overturned near the square, sending a ripple of cries. A dog darted between legs, snapping at a basket of fruit. Mareñá kept to the shadow of her crates, her neck cooled by the sliver of shade. She felt the stairs like a pressure around her shoulders. Once a man leaned in as if to buy, and then reached instead to touch his collar where his neck was unmarked. The pity in his face was a worse burn than any insult. Edric Luarte came to the market for barley twine and a new bridle. He moved through the crowd with an economy of motion, one who measured his words and his steps the way a man measures the grain that will keep his house. He had the look of someone who carried a private weather inside him, long, patient winters, a presence that dampened noise. He watched more than he spoke. The servants in his train gave him room. The street dogs did not approach him. Even so, his hand on the reins loosened as he passed Mareñá's stall. He did not know her. He did not know her name, her past, the way the scar had folded into her life. He only saw the sliver of exposed skin, the way she flinched when a buyer's heel kicked dust up at her feet. He saw the tilt of her head, the way she tucked hair behind the ear to hide the mark and how that concealment made her chin tremble. He saw, more than anything, a small human being who would be stepped over if no one lifted a foot to stop it. Edric moved away a pace. The vendors continued their hawking. A boy with a wheel of rope ran past, laughter lifting like a flare. And then, without ceremony or inquiry, Edric reached into his satchel and placed a handful of coins in the vendor's palm. "It will cover her work," he said to no one in particular, and the vendor, surprised, looked to him for the price. Edric did not bargain. He placed the coins there as if removing them would unravel some small injustice that might otherwise be done. There was no auction for Mareñá's life, no proclamation about wages. The vendor's hands tightened around the coins, then released her. Mareñá heard the clink. She had learned over the years to expect the worst. People paid for what they wanted and walked away. But the look in Edric's eyes was not the look of a buyer. It was quieter. It was a hand extended without expectation of repayment beyond the dignity of being safe. "Come with me," he said briefly, and offered a cloak that smelled faintly of cedar and rain. His voice was low, his accent was that of the valley, the long flat way of people who lived near wide fields and wide graves. It did not sound like a command. Mareñá thought of the market that had been a cage, the vendors knelt bargain that morning, the boys who'd mocked her. She had the right then to refuse. She had made refusals before, carved a life from refusal and the thin bread of self-reliance. But the idea of a longer shadow where no one pressed to see the scar, the possibility of a lock on a door that no one would rattle at dusk, felt like a currency she had scarce thought she could claim. "I will go," she said, and neither of them spoke another word until he lifted the cloak over her shoulders and led her through the press of bodies toward his coach. The horses' hooves clattered like distant drums. A child cried behind a stall. The vendor took the coins and smoothed out his apron as if to say his business returned to its ordinary concerns. When the coach rattled away, a dozen eyes followed, those who had gossiped over the years, those who had judged her. Some looked with relief that their town had made room for the spectacle to pass. Others, pockets lighter by mere coins, worried at the new rumor that would find their noon table. No one asked if she wanted shelter, no one cared if she could keep a lamp lit by herself. Yet there was one man in the market who had seen a human being and chosen to unmake the marketplace's verdict. Stay with me until the end to see why that scar changed everything. The road out of town unfolded in a ribbon of rutted dirt. Dust rose from the wheels and settled like a film over Mareñá's sleeves. Between the coach's slats she watched the town shrink. Rooftops, the square's cracked fountain, the abrupt sprawl of stacked warehouses where men argued over numbers. Edric did not speak of his wife. He drove as if the act of driving could stitch an absence into something bearable. When she dared to ask the name of the place she was going to, he answered merely, "Home." Home, as it descended over a low ridge, was exactly the sort of place that made towns whisper. It was a hacienda of broad eaves and stern pillars. Its courtyard was a flat of sun and stone, with a fountain that murmured and a stand of olive trees. The house leaned into its own history, paint flaked from shutters, the carved balustrade softened by 100 seasons. It was grand in a way that did not flatter. It kept memories as one might keep salvage. There was a portrait hung in the entrance hall, a woman in a dark dress with a slight smile, a hand resting on a closed book. Her eyes, painted with such care, seemed to look straight through Mareñá, not at her, and in that glance something tightened in Mareñá's chest, a recognition that stunned and unmoored. Gerda Lozano met them at the threshold. The housekeeper was a woman whose bones had been honed by decades of keeping house and the tempering heat of duty. Her hair was braided like a rope of grey, her eyes missed nothing. She had one hand on the keys at her waist and another on the ledger of names and duties kept by the front door. When she saw Mareñá there, the ledger's margins seemed to stiffen. "A stray should be fed," Gerda said after a long beat, as if that phrase absolved any difficulties. Her voice held a residual softness that belonged to a woman who had once been a mother to someone else's children and who still kept that gloves-off care close. "But you should know the rules before you sleep beneath my rafters." Edric inclined his head and said, "She will work. She will have a room. She will not be sent away." There was a way in which his words were both protection and set of conditions, a thin map of liberty traced with quiet firmness. Gerda's eyes flicked to the portrait at his back when he said it, and for a breath the house seemed to inhale with the weight of a memory. Mareñá was given the smallest room at the back of the house, a narrow chamber with a single shuttered window and a bed that smelled faintly of lavender. The walls had been whitewashed at some time, but now showed small stains like tiny histories. There was a basin, a chipped plate, a shelf for whatever she might be allowed. Edric's steward showed her where to leave tools and how to sign her name in the ledger. Each instruction was a quiet structure that made her feel the shape of a life she had not requested, but had been offered nonetheless. For the first days she moved like someone in a borrowed skin. House staff eyed her with the professional curiosity reserved for newness, hands that would later smooth linen around a chest, mouths that would later gossip about whether she left the kitchen at unsanctioned hours. They watched her fingers when she learned to stew the beans and to scrub a clay cup without cracking its rim. Gerda watched her most of all, with the wary tenderness of someone who keeps an altar to what is proper. Edric kept his distance in the manner of a man who had loved with a capacity that made him tender and therefore cautious. He offered small things, a bowl of broth placed outside her door in the evening, the carriage of a coat hung on a peg with its cuffs turned to show the stain removed. He would sometimes walk past the kitchen and, without looking directly at her, place a log on the pile or close the window a fraction to keep the draught out. There were no declarations shouted from the porch. There was, instead, a steadying attention, a quiet, like a fence being swung into place to keep wolves at bay. Mareñá noticed it first, in the way he moved among the men in the yard. When Quiro Mancera, a broad-shouldered peon with a grin that always suggested something unkind, slipped a jest meant to cut, Edric's gaze settled on him, and the jest stopped mid-air. Gyro's laughter died like a fish in a net. There were no grand gestures, simply a look, a small reprimand that carried with it the weight of consequence. Behavior here would be met with a standard that did not belong to the town square. Ciro resented it. Resentment, under his flatterness, was a live thing. He prowled close to Mareñá while she swept the back stoop, and once, when a visitor dropped a coin and stooped to pick it up, Ciro bent too quickly as if to help, but instead mouthed a word with the edge of his tongue. "Mocked," he hissed, letting the sound slither against the floorboards. Mareñá felt it like cold water. She had learned how to absorb such moments without giving them a name. She tightened her grip on the broom and answered with the economy she had been taught by hardship and habit. Nothing. But silence is not always a refuge. It can be a drumbeat that echoes shame until it finds purchase in the skin. When she looked up, Edric stood at the doorway, his back to the late afternoon light. He did not scold Cairo with words. He did not raise his hand. He simply crossed to Cairo in a few deliberate steps and placed a palm on the man's shoulder so that the touch was both a command and a protection at once. "You do not speak to her like that in my house," he said, and the words were the kind that made the men in the yard understand that he would marshal the law of his household and that the law would be the law of dignity. Mareñá's face warmed at that, not because she required a rescuer to feel worthy, but because the world had been so persistent in suggesting that she had no right to refuse humiliation. Edric's act was not a purchase of her person, it was a refusal of the marketplace's verdict. He had taken the currency out of the hands of those who would have used it to own her debt, and in doing so had offered a choice she had not foreseen. To stay under this roof as a person, not as a blemish to be bartered. She had not yet told him the thing she carried in her throat. Not yet could she say that the scar had more than fire in it. It had a story that lingered like a shadow. Accusation, the whisper of guilt, the sudden morbid clarity of neighbors who had once pointed to her, as if she were the reason their roofs had burned. She had never confessed the whole memory, because confession requires that someone else hold the truth without turning it into a shroud. At night she would lie awake in the little room and listen to the house breathe, the mice in the pantry, the slow tick of a clock in the parlor, the soft foot of someone going to water. The portrait in the entry hall of the late Lucina became a light that kept catching her attention. It was too well painted for a simple likeness. It captured small strengths, the tilt of a mouth that knew how to forgive, the patience of someone who had once extended a hand to a child and not been looked upon as foolish for it. One afternoon, as a rain pelted the roof in a thin, steady hand, Mareñá tidied the library on Gerda's instruction. The books were more dust than words, their bindings softened into history. She found, tucked behind a row of ledgers, a small dull medallion wrapped in paper. When she unrolled the scrap, a pressed bloom fell into her palm, lavender, brittle and sweet. The medallion bore a faint engraving, a small sun, and beneath it a set of initials she did not know. When she pressed the metal to her ear, she could almost hear a breath, as if it had been waiting for someone to call it out loud. She held it because the house had taught her to hold things. She thought of ways to turn it into something useful. She could polish it to sell perhaps, or leave it under the floorboard for a night and return it for the coin it might fetch. But when she traced the sun's engraving, a rush of memory came that was not smoke, but a hand, small, warm, pulling her through a room. The memory was too precise for the rumor that the town had spooled about her. This was a hand that had once steadied her chin and not flinched at the mark on her neck. She took the medallion not to profit, but because found objects often carry the smell of the people who loved them. When she tucked it into the fold of her dress, she felt, for the first time since the market, that she might be more than a blemish to be turned away. Edric noticed the medallion as if he had a quiet inventory of small things that belonged to this house. He found her in the garden where she had gone to breathe. A drizzle smudged the air into a wash of green. He lingered at the edge of the hedge and did not raid her privacy. He did something more delicate. He handed her a clean cloth and, with a single nod, the permission to be tended. "You should not hide that," he said, too softly for the gardener pruning the roses to hear. "It has been kept by someone who meant it to be kept." Mareñá looked at the medallion under the cloth and then at him. "I found it," she said. "I thought it might be worth—" "Worth is not always coin," he returned, "but perhaps it is worth knowing why it was kept." He stepped back then, respecting the space between them, leaving the question in the air like a letter that must be opened. Days bled into one another with small mercies. Mareñá learned the hours the house expected. The bread must rise by dawn, the cattle need water, the master's table required a certain quietude after the meal. She learned to move in the rhythm of the household, and in doing so, left space in herself to breathe without the market's gnawing eyes. At night, when the house settled and the portrait's painted eyes looked more like a memory than a picture, she would touch the medallion and try to put the puzzle of her past into its corners. Gerda remained wary. She watched Mareñá folding linens with a patience that bordered on suspicion. It was not malice that colored the housekeeper's caution, but a protective loyalty to the memory of Lucina, who had kept this house like an offering. Gerda had once believed that fidelity to a woman's legacy meant keeping the household hung to a rigid code. She had not expected harm, but she had expected harm to come like an intruder. That this new person wore a mark that had made the town bristle was a complication. "You will not break anything," Gerda warned one evening when she caught Mareñá arranging a crooked stack of plates. "You will not bring shame here." Mareñá met Gerda's eyes and saw in them not only accusation, but also the tremulous ache of someone who had loved and had been left to keep the pieces. "I did not choose this scar," she said, "but I will keep what is given me here." Gerda's face softened a fraction. It was not forgiveness, it was the beginning of an account where trust might be built. The house, with all its memory, took note. Rumors, of course, moved like smoke. News of Mareñá's arrival spread among those who worked the fields and the barns. Cyro's barbed remarks were not the only barbs. A few days later, when Mareñá fetched water from the well, she found that someone had left a folded scrap of old paper at the lip, with a bitter message looped in crude ink. The paper read like the town's memory written in spittle: "Keep your kind to the market." She could have let it burn, left it to the well's dark. Instead, she tucked it into her palm, carried it like a small stone. It would not bury her. It was a thing to be recognized, not an identity to be surrendered. That evening the house sat at a peculiar angle. Dusk pooled in the courtyard, and the lanterns were lit with the careful hand of ritual. The men ate their stew, and the women folded their linen, and Edric retreated to his study with the measured gait of someone who keeps grief as one keeps a lamp, under glass and never in sight of draughts. Mareñá washed a pan and laid it to dry, and then, because the world aches for stories to be told aloud, she whispered a fragment to the room. "I remember fire," she said, almost without meaning to. "I remember smoke. I remember someone lifting me." The spoon clinked in the sink. No one forced her voice into submission, but a silence settled that was not unkind. It was attentive listening. When she finally let herself say more, she chose her words like a woman who knows the weight of each syllable. "I woke in a yard and they told me I had started the flame. Her throat closed. The rest of the sentence was softer than the hush between two prayers. It was the kind of confession that asked for witness, not pity. Edric appeared at the doorway. He had not overheard her. He had come because the kettle had whistled, and he'd noticed the light in the kitchen. His face, in that low glow, was something Mareñá could almost read. Not pity, not judgment, but a recognition of loss. He did not press for details. He did not demand confession. He only offered a cup of water and held it out as if it were a promise. "I cannot change what people said then," he said. "But the house can keep you now, if you choose it." Choice. The word itself felt unfamiliar in its generosity. She had been saved from the market by his coin, but the decision to remain was hers and hers alone. She looked at the medallion tucked in her dress, and then at the portrait over the mantel, Lucina's painted eyes full of something like benediction, and for the first time in a long stretch of days she felt a small seed of possibility pry itself free from the rock of her chest. The days that followed were not suddenly kind. Cyro's sneers grew more inventive, his elbows finding new ways to elbow her into the margin. Once he knocked a basket of cloths to the ground and let the linen trail like a deliberate humiliation. The men around him smirked. They were men who had little else to measure their worth by, and ended up measuring it by what they could make others bear. This time, his cruelty had a cost in the yard beyond pride. One of the cows startled. A child playing near the gate cried out as a bucket tipped. Edric left his chair by the fountain and moved through the men without haste. He did not push Cairo into the dirt or shout the way a theatre might demand. Instead, he took Cairo aside with a hand on his arm and spoke in that low voice that made other men listen, not from fear, but from the thought that this man had choices beyond the moment. "You will apologize," Edric said plainly, and Ciro's jaw clenched. He did, eventually, muttering the words into Mareñá's direction with the weight of someone naming a thing he would rather not have named at all. Mareñá heard the apology as if it were something gilded and offered to the wrong altar. She had been given safety, and yet safety is not the same as ease. It was a beginning, an offering with a long negotiation yet ahead. That night, a man arrived unsettled and panting like someone who had run down the lane from the town. He was the sort whose work took him from field to field. Rumo Castrillo, a messenger of sorts, one who knew roads and rumors and held on to small truths that other men would have lost. He waited at the gate while his horse huffed steam into the cooling air and caught his breath. The servants peered at him and whispered. He came into the courtyard with a piece of news strapped to his chest like a small animal. When he crossed into the parlor, he did not stop at pleasantries. He stood there, hat in his hands, and looked straight at Mareñá. For a moment the world narrowed to the circle of light that fell from the chandelier. "I have traveled far enough to know that mark," Rumo said, and his voice did not offer judgment so much as an information that refused to be ignored. "I have seen it before." Mareñá's fingers tightened on the cloth in her lap. She had practiced not flinching at words like that, had trained herself to watch them arc away without lodging in the throat. But the way Rumo said it, without slur, without rumor, made it different. It sounded like a beginning or an end, and she did not yet know which. Gerda's mouth worked. The men gathered in the doorway exchanged glances. Edric watched Rumo with the same steady attention he gave to the weather. There was no immediate judgment on his face, only a calculation. The house, which had been learning to live with its new guest, held its breath. Rumo laid a hand on the table and leaned forward. There was evidence in his satchel, he said. He had traveled with a scrap of something that might illuminate what had happened years ago. For a man who trafficked in the small truths of roads and markets, he had brought with him the habit of arriving at a point and stopping, as if that pause could help the world find the right name for what had happened. Mareñá's heart started to hammer. It was a new thing for her heart to do inside a quiet house. She felt suddenly that the past she had smoothed over like a hand-washed cloth was bunched up beneath her fingers, waiting to be seen. Whether it would be a vindication or another lash of shame she could not yet tell. But the presence of Rumo, this man who had come with a claim that matched the scar on her neck, was a hinge on which the next days would turn. Outside, the olive trees bowed in a wet breeze. The house seemed to lean in toward itself, listening for the next word that would decide whether whisper could become truth. Rumo's announcement settled in the room like rain at a window, little steady taps that demanded an answer. He set his satchel on the table with deliberate care and drew from it a folded scrap of cloth, edges singed and smelling faintly of smoke even now. The piece was no more than a sliver, a strip with one corner threaded by a coarse stitch. It was the sort of thing a man might not think to keep, except that Rumo kept what others left behind. He kept marks, words, and small things that signaled truth. "This came from the house that burned," he said. His voice, worn by road and weather, was crisp with the habit of telling what he had seen plainly. "I found it where the ruin lay, tucked beneath a beam where a child had likely lain. It was caught in a bundle of cloth someone used to carry what they would not leave behind." He did not embellish. He placed the scrap on the table before them all like an accusation that had no name yet. Mareñá bent until her nose was almost level with the wood. The scrap was familiar in the way that old grief sometimes is, an echo of a texture you once gripped when you'd been small and cold. The particular stitching did not match the coarse weave of farm clothes. It was finer, a careful hand that had mended often and tenderly. Something in Mareñá's memory stirred. A woman's fingers, the press of a palm, a voice that had once said, "Hold on, I have you." Gerda's lips tightened. She had the habit of looking for practical faults, and now she looked for them in Rumo's argument, where it might fray, where it might be bent into rumor. The men in the doorway leaned forward, the afternoon light painting their chins into small sudden maps. Edric said nothing for a long moment. That silence carried weight. It was not absence so much as the manner of a man listening to the house's bones creak and deciding whether the sound signaled danger or age. When he spoke, his voice was low, careful, as the way one moves a fragile jaw. "Where did you find it?" he asked. Rumo pointed to a narrow place in his bag and then to the lane he had traveled. His words were precise. He had walked the burned site. He had watched as men moved timber and took what they could. He had seen a sack dropped, and beneath it the scrap twined with ash. "I kept it because the stitch looked not like the common work of those who mend harnesses. It was like a woman's hand had done it. And the night a man boasts to the wrong person hears it." Ciro's mouth was a thin line. He had been careful with his gestures until then, careful to let cruelty glint and not expose himself to the law of eyes. Now those same hands had no ready armor. Sweat dampened the collar at his neck. The men smelled it and shifted. One of them muttered to the other, and the sound came like a small animal being pressed into silence. "You say what you please," Cairo spat, and his voice tried to be large, but it was thin at the edges. "The town will believe what it pleases." "Then let the town listen now," Edric said. He rose and walked to the window as if to gather something from the light. When he turned, the sun made the small dust motes visible, tiny circles of world that caught in the air like the memory of smoke. He put out his hand to the men gathered and did not raise his voice. "Rumo says he found this at the ruins," he said. "He says it matched a stitch he has seen done only by one woman. If that is so, then there is reason to put questions to those who were there that night. If there is a man among us who cares to explain his presence at the house when it burned, he should do so now." There was no courthouse to call them to. There was only the yard and the men who worked it, and the house with its portrait that watched them all as if to remind them that some promises belong to the living as much as to the dead. Cairo's jaw moved. He had the braggart's habit of speaking as if words could fill the gap left by conscience. Yet the hush that followed Edric's measured command was not the hush of fear alone. It was the hush of a group finding it necessary to place the truth plainly upon a table. Rumo added what he could. He had heard on the road how one man, Ciro, had bragged in the inn months before the fire that he would make trouble for a household that would not pay his debt. He had overheard, he said, a slur of words about shaking a town down by setting small fires near storehouses to frighten owners into paying for protection. Men did speak like that when they had the wine in the dark, and sometimes one of them would boast as if the boast were a coin. Rumo, who had a memory like a ledger, had remembered Kiro's voice. Mareñá's breath became a small animal inside her chest. Memory slid under her ribs and threw its weight. The way a shutter had moved suddenly, a smell of oil and tar, the face of someone who laughed even as the flames licked higher. She remembered being carried, and a woman's voice soft at the edge of the roar. But memory, by its nature, asks to be believed. It sits and waits until evidence comes. Rumo had brought a small piece of that evidence, and with it, the way to tell a story that was not rumor but could be shown. Gerda stepped forward then, her hands folded as if in prayer or judgment. It was always hard at first to tell the difference with her. "If this is true," she said, "then we have had the wrong person suffer the shame. If this is true, we have been harsh to a woman who did not deserve the sling of accusation." Ciro reddened. The color crept like a stain to his ears. He put his shoulder against the doorframe as if bracing himself, and then, perhaps because the circle of attention had become an iron ring, he spoke with an edge that had been tempered down by scorn into a brittle thing. "It was not me," he said at first. Then, as if words pressed by the weight of many eyes can shatter a brittle thing, he stammered, A cough seized him. The men watched his jaw work. You want me to lie and say nothing. Fine. But it would be your word against mine, and the town will not change its memory for the sake of a scrap of cloth." Edric crossed the room slowly. He did not come like a judge to condemn only. He came like a man who believed the house must keep one standard, and that standard was dignity. He looked at Cairo and said quietly, "Then tell us what you did that night. Tell us why you were near that house when the fire started." Ciro looked at the floor, as if the wood might open and swallow him. The courtyard outside buzzed with the low noise of men at their tasks and a child's delayed laugh. After a long time, the confession rose, a small halting thing. "I went to take a debt," he said. "They owed. I thought to frighten them into paying. I had a rag. I set a small—" He swallowed. It became more than I planned. It caught faster than I thought. The shutters couldn't be closed. His voice broke. It was not the theatrical weeping of a man seeking pity. It was the strangled sound of someone admitting to a thing too heavy to bear alone. I ran. I said the wrong thing to the wrong people. I said I saw her, Mareñá, by the back door, and they believed because she had a mark, and it seemed like an easy story. The room was silent after that, as if all of them had been waiting to see whether Kiro's confession would be marshaled into the shape of lies or truth. Rumo's face was unreadable. Gerda's hands tightened. The men shifted their weight. Evidence does strange things to a community. It makes the air heavier, but it also demands a reckoning. Mareñá felt a peculiar lightness in the center of herself as the words landed, not because the memory vanished, but because truth, once named aloud, can do the work of separating what one has been told about oneself from what one truly is. She had been blamed and made to hold the stigma like a cloak. Now someone else had admitted to the act that had set that cloak afire. The recognition was not triumph. It was a quiet undoing, like a seam being carefully loosened. Edric turned to Cairo with the same steady regard he had offered all men. There was no gloating in his face. He was not a man to wield power for the taste of it. He simply said, "You must leave, go to another place and earn what you can with honest work, or you must answer to those you have wronged in the ways this place will permit. You will not be allowed to make such danger here again." Cairo spat on the floor. "You will not ruin me," he snarled. "You have already ruined yourself," Gerda answered. Her voice was not kind. It bore the weight of a woman who had kept the house of another and had no patience for men who would set flame to a thing and then blame the smoke on those without power. She walked to the ledger and took a pen as if writing Cairo's name as someone would mark a debt that would not be forgotten. The consequence was not a justice by law. There was no magistrate to deliver sentence. It was, instead, a social expulsion that would leave Cairo with work few would trust him with and eyes that would not let him rest easy. He had traded the comfort of a town's complicity for the sharp, cold knowledge of what his own hands had done. He left before dusk that day, his back a tight line, the straw in his hut already becoming less good for sleep. When the door closed and the men drifted back to their tasks, the house itself sighed as if relieved. The portrait over the mantel seemed to watch the scene fold back into ordinary care. Mareñá sat with her hands heaped in her lap and felt the medallion there, small and warm against her palm. Rumo had done what messengers often do, carry scraps that become truths, carry them to doors that could use light, and then he said he would go. He did not seek reward beyond the satisfaction of a ledger balanced. Before he left, he handed Edric a small paper, something he had found woven into the scrap, half ash, half inked words. It was a map of sorts, a short note with the name of a hamlet, where the year before, a woman had taken a child out of a burning field and given what help she could. Rumo had never been able to say whether that woman had been Lucina, but the ink and the stitch suggested hands that had loved with a quiet, steady mend. "It matters little what we call cause and what we call accident," Rumo said as he gathered his satchel. "What matters is the order of truth. You have given her shelter, now you have given her witness. The rest is for time." Edric bowed his head in a motion that was almost ritual. He did not stay Rumo with further thanks, because the habit of a man like him is to keep gratitude short and to return it by action rather than words. Rumo walked down the lane and, as he disappeared into the evening, the house felt a margin widen around the new life that would be allowed to grow in it. After the men dispersed, Gerda lingered with Mareñá in the kitchen. She had the habit of hands busy with work while her mind turned over weightier things. She set a kettle on for tea and moved around the maid as if she were both making space and measuring the woman by the way she handled the teacup. "You did not speak of the night," Gerda said, not unkindly. The kettle sang, a soft thread. She had held to the house of Lucina like one holds a relic. Tender, perhaps, foolish to some, but she would defend that relic's honor with a ferocity that surprised even those who knew her. "You did not tell what they said you had done?" Mareñá steadied herself and met Gerda's gaze. There was a small tremor in her voice, but the words were chosen with care. "I was frightened. They told me I had done what I had not. I learned to repeat that thing they said as if it were true, until my voice fit it well enough that I believed it some nights. I thought that if I kept quiet, I would not be taken again." She paused, fingers worrying at the edge of her sleeve. I did not ask for pity. I asked only for the chance to keep myself. Gerda's expression softened with a weight that was not easily lifted. She set 2 cups on the table and pushed one toward Mareñá. The kettle's steam framed the moment like a small halo. "This house has rules," Gerda said. "It also has mercy. Lucina." She stopped. The portrait's painted eyes seemed to press from their frame. Gerda's voice wavered, the only time it did. "Lucina used to say that a good house should not be a prison for its grief. It should be a room where grief is learned, and then allowed to walk away if the living no longer need it." She reached out, and for the first time, touched Mareña's hand with a quick, assessing press. "You will show me you work," she said. "You will not steal from this house the memory it keeps, but you will also not be asked to carry shame that is not yours." Mareñá let out something between a laugh and a sob. It was felt in her ribs. It was not the triumphant cry of someone who had won a public battle. It was simply the sound of being allowed to place one burden down. The house resumed its routines in the following days with a softer tide. The men treated Mareñá with a new sort of caution, the kind that learns to measure its mockery against the cost of being wrong. Edric's attention did not become tender in a parade. He did not decide to make proclamations. Instead, he offered steadiness. Hours when the gate was locked, a cook who left an extra bowl by her door, the steward who took a little less as if to make room. Mareñá answered with quiet competence. She tended the small garden, coaxed seedlings, learned the patterns of the house, and in the evenings sat by the back window and watched the dust motes at play in the lamplight, like tiny planets moving in the soft gravity of a home. Weeks later, when the house had settled enough to allow explorations beyond the daily chores, Edric opened a trunk in his study that had not been touched since Lucina's funeral. He had resisted opening it because one can keep grief safe by locking it away. But now, with truth uncoiling, he had the courage to see what else might be kept there. The trunk revealed letters wrapped in a faded ribbon, pressed flowers, and a small bundle of things: a child's mitten, a string of beads, and a piece of paper folded careful like a prayer. He had not meant for Mareñá to see them, but she had been standing in the doorway as if drawn by the hush of the room. When Edric unfolded the paper, his eyes moved over the handwriting and something shifted in his face. The ink slanted in a hand he recognized, Lucina's. Edric read the letter silently, and Mareñá watched him read as one watches a man trying to learn from memory what to say. When he finished, the house seemed to take in a breath. The letter was short, but what it carried was long. A request, a benediction, a permission. "My Edric," Lucina had written, "if you ever find yourself alone with a heart that still remembers my shape, do not let the memory of me be a chain around your life. If a soul comes to your door who bears a scar the way I once bore a bruise, do not ask whether she is clean in the eyes of the town. Ask whether she is clean in the eyes of her own heart. If she is weary, give her rest. If she is frightened, give her shelter. If the world has been unkind to her, be kinder. If ever such a person needs a place to mend, I would have you give it. Love me and let love live." Edric's thumb found the medallion again, the one Mareñá had found and tucked away. He set the medallion alongside the letter and let them speak together. One object a small sun in metal, the other a woman's careful plea. The initials on the medallion matched the signature at the bottom of the letter. The proof that the medallion belonged to Lucina was small and certain. He called Mareñá into the study, not to demand anything, but because the letter, Lucina's written voice, seemed like a third presence in the room that deserved to be acknowledged in the light. Mareñá came and stood by the desk, her fingers folded as if to hold herself steady. When Edric laid the medallion and the letter before her, she did not reach for them at once. She let them speak to one another in silence. "This was hers," Edric said. "She kept such things close. He hesitated, the sentence unfinished by the way grief and memory complicate speech. "She asked me to be brave enough to let life in again." Mareñá's mouth opened and closed. There were words she wanted to say that had no home for them yet. At last she touched the medallion and felt the metal cool into her palm. The sun engraving caught the light, a small bright witness. "You were there," she said, voice small. "You saved me once." Edric looked at her without the stoicism that had become his armor, something softer for the moment. "I did not know then," he said, "but I have kept what my wife asked. I will not pretend to be her or to know what she would have wanted, except that she wanted mercy. She wanted me, after her, to be a man who could choose life for the living. Mareñá swallowed. The decision that had been placed before her months ago, the choice to stay under a roof that had become a refuge, had always been hers to make. Now that choice shone with a new light. The late wife's words were not an order so much as an offering of permission. It was as if Lucina, who could no longer speak, had left a small map of how to honor grief without letting it calcify into a shrine. You have not purchased me, Mareñá said, voice steady now. She felt the memory of the market coin like a bruise softened by healing. You have freed me from an auction. I can stay here if I choose. I can leave if I wish. I will not be bait or a story for the town. Edric inclined his head. You will have your work and your space. You will have the choice to be part of this house in whatever measure you wish. No one will place a price on what you are. There was a pause, as if both of them needed the silence to draw a line between what had been and what might be. The portrait over the mantel seemed to smile, if a painted smile can be called that. Lucina's face in oil had the quality of forgiveness that had been born from a woman who must have known the small failures of others and chosen to hold the better parts. Mareñá read the letter then, aloud, though her voice trembled at times. Lucina's words filled the study, and with them, some of the ghostly pressure that had hovered over the house seemed to settle into an ordinary air. If you find yourself alone with a heart that still remembers my shape, do not let the memory of me be a chain around your life. Mareñá's voice grew steadier as she read. The letters were not only a blessing to Edric. They were a benediction to anyone who had weathered the world and come seeking shelter. When she reached the end, a small hush reassembled in the room, as if the house itself had lingered to hear a prayer it had once known in a different voice. Gerda, who had come to stand at the study's threshold, let out a small sound, half laughter, half release. The housekeeper's skeptical armor had softened into a crust of frost that would not melt all at once, but that would allow sunlight through. She crossed to Mareñá and, in a movement that surprised them both, embraced her briefly. Not a possessive hold, but a gesture like a hand closing around offered trust. You will do the work, Gerda murmured, and you will keep your head. I will watch, but I will also watch for your good. Lucina would have wanted it. The weeks that followed were small and careful. Mareñá and Edric's closeness grew not by the force of a sudden passion, but by a series of tiny, ordinary exchanges that made companionship feel like a garment they could both wear. Edric learned the slow humor of watching a woman braid rosemary into a roast. Mareñá learned the fine ways a man arranges his papers so that the house keeps its rhythm. They spoke in glances and in economy of words, Edric's specialty, and in sudden soft sentences slipped beneath the ordinary. There were moments that felt like turning stones and finding small things gleam beneath. Edric would place a bowl of soup at Mareñá's door on a night when the wind had a bite, a bowl that had been seasoned carefully not out of mercy to a lesser thing, but because he believed the household deserved rightness in every plate. Mareñá would, in turn, leave a sprig of lavender by Lucina's portrait, as if to tell the dead woman that her wishes were honored, and that living had not been abandoned for relic. Gerda noticed such things, and between mending sheets and scolding the men, allowed herself a small smile. One evening, as the sun sank and turned the courtyard into a small pool of gold, Edric found Mareñá sitting on the low wall near the fountain, her hand tracing the worn lip as if to remind herself of weight. The medallion lay on a string at her throat. The scar along her neck caught the light in a way that no longer made people recoil but seemed to hold a map of nights survived. He sat beside her, a small space kept open. He did not take her hand at once. Instead, he watched the way the dust motes moved through the sun, a personal cosmos, and let the silence lay itself between them like a soft cloth. You could go, he said then, the words falling like pebbles into the fountain. If it is ever your wish to leave and find your own way, this house will not hold you by contract. It will wish you well. Mareñá turned to him and, for the first time in a long time, felt no need to armor herself. The market's gaze had hardwired a protective habit into her posture. Here, with a man who offered steadiness instead of possession, she could let that drop. I could, she said, and I could stay. He looked at her then, as if seeing her for the first time unencumbered by the story the town had told. Why stay? He asked, softly, not to demand but to understand. She thought of the medallion, of Lucina's letter, of Gerda's guarded hand, of the bowl at her door. She thought of the way the men in the yard had learned to measure themselves by better things, the way Rumo had carried truth in his satchel, the way Kiro had walked away shamed by his own confession. She felt the scar under her fingers, a line that no longer flinched at the suggestion of sun. "Because here I can be more than a mark," she said. "Because here someone looks and does not try to own what they see. Because that house has not turned my shame into spectacle but into story. Because I can work and learn. Because," and she hesitated a moment, "because I have come to think that what Lucina asked of you, a kindness, can be the way I learn to be kind to myself." Edric's mouth curved, not into a wide smile but into an expression that held gratitude and surprise in equal measure. He reached out then, slowly, and took her hand. His fingers were steady and warm. The touch was not a claim but an offer. "I would like to walk beside you," he said, plain and careful, "if you will have me. Not as a man who bought refuge, but as one who has been given the chance to choose life again and wishes to share it." Mareñá felt the word choose in the room like a small bell. She had been chosen before by the market's coin in a way that had lacked choice. This was different. She could feel the difference with the small muscles at the base of her throat. "Yes," she said, and the single word struck true. "I will walk beside you if you ask me." Edric closed his fingers around hers as if sealing an agreement made of hands rather than ink. They sat like that for a long time, the fountain's murmurs keeping them company, the portrait's eyes on the mantel remaining a quiet witness. No grand vows were spoken, there was no fevered embrace, there was only two people aligning themselves like planets settling into an orbit both new and easy. In the days that followed, the house changed subtly. Where before there had been a watchful reserve, now there was a thrum of life that had been absent for seasons. Laughter came more readily, Gerda's sharper laugh at a man's clumsy attempt to mend a fence, the servant girls singing softly as they ironed sheets, lower voices that spoke of plans for new plantings in the garden. The men who had once measured their worth by cruelty now found other currencies: competency, steadiness, the pride in a job well done. It was not that the past was erased, scars remained in memory and in bodies, but the way the community measured itself altered, because a household had decided to hold itself by the standard of dignity. Lucina's portrait was never taken down. It did not need to be. Her memory, as Gerda intended, was not a chain, but a lamp. On mornings when the light through the window fell across the painted face, Mareñá would tuck lavender into the frame and whisper thanks. Sometimes she spoke aloud to the woman in oil as if to a friend. "Thank you," she would say, "for the letter, for the medallion, for—" She never finished the list because words sometimes crowd the heart and spill. There were times when Mareñá still felt the old reflexes, a child pointing, a merchant averting his eyes, whispers curling like smoke at the edge of town talk. But now she had Edric's hand on the threshold, Gerda's guarded approval in the kitchen, and the medallion at her throat to remind her that some marks are not just the residue of accident, but the shape of survival. Months later, the hacienda's spring brought a small festival among the workers, a day of mending fences and mending ties, of a meal laid out long and ordinary on the long table. The men and women who worked the land came with bottles of wine and a turkey crisped over coals. Children ran between legs, and older men argued over trivial things and then laughed at themselves. There was a kind of reinvigoration in the air that felt like a community learning, slowly, to hope again. Gerda, for once, allowed herself the ease of satisfaction. She walked among the workers with a napkin over her arm and a sharp eye for a table not set properly. When she reached Mareñá, who brought a bowl of stew, the housekeeper tapped the girl's shoulder and, in the briefest of confessions, said, "You have surprised me." Mareñá smiled. "I have been surprising myself," she answered. Edric stood where he had always stood at such gatherings, near the head of the table, not for dominion but because habit and duty placed him there. He lifted his cup when the conversation lulled and, in a few sentences that did not pretend to be more than they were, told of the small mercy that had kept the house from being a shrine to memory and had made it instead a place for living. "No one would have wanted that scar," he said quietly, looking at Mareñá as if she were both his neighbor and his anchor. The words echoed like the opening line that had begun the story months before, but then he added what had changed. But the world is made of people who can refuse the marketplace's cruel bargains. We have chosen to hold dignity as currency here. Murmurs ran through the crowd. Approval, the kind that is slow to form and deep once it sets. Children clapped where they had been asked to help with a small game. The men raised their voices in friendly mockery. Mareñá felt the medallion warm against her skin, the way a living thing does when it rests near a beating heart. As the sun lowered and lanterns were lit, Edric offered Mareñá his hand in a manner that had become for them a ritual of choice. He extended it not as a claim but as a continuing invitation. "Walk with me tonight?" he asked. She took his hand. It was a small gesture in the midst of a day of many small things, but the act sealed what had been agreed upon, not a binding contract, but a mutual consent to begin walking side by side. They strolled among the tables, and the house's laughter and talk rose like a chorus that did not press but celebrated. That night, later, when the house had quieted and the lanterns burned low, Mareñá sat on the porch with Edric at her side. The air had a cool bite, and the dust motes that the midday sun had revealed in a different season were now small ghosts in the lamplight. The scar at her throat glinted in the half-light like a map. She laid her fingers over it, and felt not shame but the faint, odd pride of a woman who had been what she was, and had remained so. It had become, she realized, a map not of ruin but of survival. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked then. Regret being an honest thing to ask when two have taken a step into an unknown future. Edric considered the question as if it were a stone he could turn in his palm. "Sometimes I regret not having been braver sooner," he said. "But I do not regret giving you the choice to stay. I regret nothing that allowed us to be honest now." Mareñá looked at him, the man who had come to a market for a bridal and left with a life that would hold him in it. She thought of the coin he had placed in that vendor's palm, a small irreversible act, and of Rumo's scrap that had made truth available. She thought of Lucina's letter, and of Gerda's wary blessing. She thought of the scar, and what it had stolen from her, and what it had given in return. A path to someone who would look and not claim. "No one wanted that scar," she said softly, as if speaking the first line of an old song, "until you bought it." Edric let the sentence rest a moment, the way one allows a simple truth to find its place. He did not laugh. He did not make a speech. He simply pressed her hand and said, "You did not belong to a market, and I did not buy what was not yours to sell. I offered a shelter. You accepted it by your will. That is what matters." Mareñá leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat in the quiet where the house's heart beat slow and sure. The night wrapped them in a modest blessing. No trumpet sounded. There was nothing theatrical about the way their lives had changed. There was the honest, practical work of living, of mending a fence or a table, of making a meal and washing a plate, of sharing small silences and choosing daily to trust a hand. By spring, the scar had lost much of the sting it had once carried. Townfolk who had once stared now greeted her with a nod that suggested a new memory was taking root, that of a woman who belonged to a household where dignity was kept. The medallion remained at her throat and was, in small towns, a curious thing that led to questions and then to stories of how Lucina had been and how she had asked Edric to choose mercy. The narrative, once turned, had a gentler arc. On a morning when the sky was the pale blue of washed linen, Mareñá and Edric walked the fields together. The men working the land paused their tasks to watch the two of them pass, not with the keen curiosity that had once stalked Mareñá, but with an ease that suggested acceptance. The wind carried the scent of grass and the faint ghost of lavender, and dust motes spun in the sun like small planets around them. They walked without haste, their hands sometimes touching, sometimes apart, an ease that grows only when two people have agreed to be honest with one another. At the gate, Mareñá stopped and turned to Edric. The scar at her throat revealed itself to the morning like any other mark of a life lived. She placed her hand to his and, in the simple silence of consent, let him see that she would not be hidden again. "I am not a story to be told for profit," she said quietly, the words carrying the weight of a woman who had learned to name herself after being named by others. "I am me." Edric smiled then, a small private thing that belonged to both of them. "You are," he agreed. They went on into the field where the work waited, something ordinary, steady, like the kind of life a home should sustain. Behind them, the house held its memories, but no longer allowed sorrow to become a prison. Lucina's portrait still watched, and sometimes Mareñá would pause to lay a sprig of lavender by its frame. The medallion at her throat caught light, and in that small gleam, the old market's verdict was unmade. No one wanted that scar, and in the ledger of town talk, the phrase would pass into a pointed memory. But the scar, which had been a stigma, became instead a map of survival and of how two people found one another in the small acts of shelter, witness, and consent. The purchase at the market had been the first of many small mercies that unfolded into a life. A coin taken from exploitation, so a woman could sleep in a room that belonged to no one's rumor. A letter from a woman gone that sanctioned love after grief. A man who learned to protect without possessing. A housekeeper who learned to trust again. At dusk, the hacienda's lamps were lit, and from a distance, the place looked like a small star, contained, constant, willing to hold more than memory. Mareñá and Edric, with their quiet hands and careful choices, walked back to it as if to a home they had both helped build. The scar, once a wound that had marked her as less in the town's eyes, was now a line of testimony, of survival, and of the dignity that two people had chosen to place at the center of a household. If this story reached you and stirred something in your chest, share it with someone who believes in the slow work of healing. Like and subscribe for more tales where mercy, quiet courage, and the dignity of small acts make a place for life to begin again.